Tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Whenever I go to that place I know.
100 kilometers north of Prince Edward Island, a hook-shaped archipelago along the shipping lanes in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Ile de la Madeleine. The waters that attracted the early Basques and spurred a seafaring history are still its dominant influence today. In this episode, we'll offer evidence from the diary of Jacques Cartier. We'll descend way down into the depths of the ancient island rock. We'll follow the preservation of sand dunes, the protection of endangered species. The list goes on and on. So, sit you down a while. We're in for a tale of island life in this little-known part of the country. The Lucy Maud Montgomery completes her daily run, a 5-hour journey from Souris PEI to Ile de la Madeleine. Heading through the channel delineated by the landmark Ile d'Entrée, the ferry announces her arrival at home port, Cap aux Moules. "200 meters below ground, geologist James Maya starts his inspection tour at the salt mine of Gros-Île.
The Madeleine Islands themselves owe their existence more or less to the presence of salt domes underneath. Salt has a particularity to form big mushrooms or domes that just etch their way or inch their way towards the surface, pushing in front of them whatever rock is over. As the salt domes push their way towards the surface, it caused the emergence of an archipelago of islands that we call the Madeleine Islands now.
Les Îles de la Madeleine, a geological phenomenon, a world of its own, home for Hélène Chevrier.
Des fois, ça me donne l'impression un peu.
Often, although it's an archipelago, it feels like being on a ship. Like life on a boat with its constraints and grandeur, life on an archipelago also has its constraints and its richness.
Fate and endurance, a common bond of the Madelino. Leonard Clark.
All of these people, they were like I like to think of them as a bunch of little birds that are looking for a place to sit and be left alone. Why else would they come to this lonely island that was so isolated? It'd be like living on the backside of the moon. There was no communication whatsoever in the wintertime. But to them, it's what they were looking for.
An ecologically fragile cluster of 12 islands, islets, and outcroppings, 200 square kilometers of land. A part of the province of Quebec, while geographically in Atlantic Canada. Socially, Les Îles are at the watershed of Acadian and Quebecois culture. Its population tripling with summer visitors, the 15,000 residents today, the majority francophone, embrace the qualities of island life.
Moi, je suis d'une famille de 8 enfants, puis mon père, il était commerçant.
I come from a family of 8 children.
Dans un commerce général.
My father ran a general store where he sold practically everything people needed.
Alors, quand on était petit, moi,
I remember when we were children, we had no car in the winter.
On n'avait pas de voiture.
I also remember when electricity was first installed on the archipelago. We had none before that.
Puis quand on était petit, ben, on jouait beaucoup dehors.
As children, we played outside a lot. It was a good life and still is for children. Definitely a non-threatening milieu.
Beaucoup de menaces pour les enfants, là.
The Gulf of St. Lawrence embodies the history of North America. Preceded by Basque fishermen, it was Jacques Cartier who motivated European interest in les arènes, as he called them. His notations would launch an assault on the island's colonies of sea mammals that would span centuries.
Cartier, when he landed on the main islands in 1534, he gave a very vivid description of what he saw. And one of the things he said, from this cape to another cape, about 14 leagues. And he says, southwest of the second cape, there's an island high and pointed, which we call Elysee. Now the second cape can only be Point Boss. You'll see there in the distance in the haze. And over here, about 5 leagues, is the entry island, which is exactly as Cartier described it, high and pointed southwest of the second cape. Other things he said that is behind us, that the land was fashioned in a half circle, and he described the inland sea, which is the eastern end of the lagoon. Cartier's diary tells us that he arrived at the Bird Islands, or Ile Margot, which is today's Bird Rocks, and he took on a boatload of birds, which was a common practice for Europeans for years after Cartier. He then moved on to Ile Brion, or Bryan Island, and he landed there. He spent the night there taking on wood and water. And Cartier gave quite a description of the plant life on Bryan Island, and he also mentioned for the first time the walrus, but he didn't use them he didn't call them by that name. He referred to them as sea oxen, somewhat like an elephant with huge teeth in their mouth.
The huge teeth, tusks, were the focus for ivory exploitation, as the walrus, till then only threatened by the killer whale, became the target of industry. The arrival of Richard Gridley and a handful of Acadians marked the start of settlement and an era of decimation.
But Gridley built 5 houses for his walrus hunters here at the East End. I don't know if you're familiar with what they call the cut method or not. The cut method was something, I believe, that they learned from the native people. By doing this, like when the walrus would come to crawl out on the estuaries or the rocks, they'd line themselves along across the broad front of the rock, and then they'd pull out. Another row behind them, wanting to get out, would nudge the fellow on the rock with his tusks, and he would move ahead. When the third row came, the guy touched the first fellow, he nudged the fellow in front of him, and it started a chain reaction, and they'd work right up onto the top of the cape. They'd even go as high as 60 feet, according to Haldeman. The walrus had a very poor eyesight, only about 20 yards, but his hearing and his smell were so keen that they could only approach the herds when the wind was on shore. The walrus were cut off along that cape line, driven through here to a holding ground that just at the end of where those trees are, at the end of those trees. And here they were taken 30, 40 at a time to a place of slaughter. Now this became known as the Seacow Pass. Now over the years, it's hard to say how many were taken through, but in 1765, nearly 2,000 were taken through this pass. So if we look at 200 years, it's quite a staggering figure. They were shot along both sides down here, along the beach side and along the bay side. This is a musket ball, a genuine one. This is killed a walrus. The Jersey men, they were here in time, a couple of Jersey families and a couple of Irish, to capitalize on the walrus. But by 1790, the walrus wouldn't take no more. They were being hunted in by vessels rather than the cut method that was out, and they were driven from the Gulf.
Today, Les Îles de la Madeleine offer numerous examples of species and environmental protection, hands-on projects aimed at creating awareness, motivate action in various areas of preservation.
Les îles, c'est un petit milieu, mais il y a une bonne variété là, de plantes.
The islands are a small world offering a great variety of plants and
Des
birds.
habitudes récentes, surtout, là, qui amènent les gens à fréquenter les plages.
The change in human lifestyle with a larger use of the beaches has threatened the extinction of a bird considered endangered across the country, the piping plover.
Considéré comme en danger à travers le Canada, c'est le pluvier siffleur. Ce petit oiseau-là, il s'installe dans les plages, là où il y a des petits cailloux, et puis il fait juste
This
une
little
dépression.
bird digs a small hole in the ground and nests its eggs there. While the eggs resemble beach pebbles, this camouflage is fragile to the egg's survival because you don't always see them.
Si on prête attention, on va l'entendre parce qu'il a un cri très siffleur.
You can hear the bird though, its chirp is very loud.
Le dérangement était tel qu'on a décidé de faire des aires de
Now
protection.
protected zones have been designed for this bird with warning notices installed on the periphery big enough to ensure that the bird won't be disturbed.
devrait permettre à l'oiseau de ne pas être dérangé.
The archipelago's more than 300 kilometers of beaches hold a fathomless list of seafaring stories. Along historic shipping lanes to the heartland of North America, the Magdalens are noted in countless ships' logs.
I was brought up in a time when we were still completely isolated. And the older people would gather together in the evenings, play cards, and they would tell stories. But no matter what the story was when they started out, they always ended up with shipwreck stories. And gathering place in my time was my grandmother's. And they would tell stories that they remembered, and of course, that older people had told them, you see, so we were getting oral history from the very beginning.
The people of Les Îles de la Madeleine continue to count on the resources of the sea for their livelihood. This aquaculture operation of Alain Huet and Michel Fournier produces mussels. Mainly for local consumption, the volume is spurred by seasonal tourism, itself a significant part of the Magdalene's economy. The processing of lobster, mackerel, and scallops, caught locally and shipped to world markets, is vital as a self-sustaining industry. Where once almost all of their needs were produced at hand, modernization, while making island life less insular, has leaned toward more of a dependency on goods brought in from the outside.
C'est peut-être moins isolé que quand on n'est pas dans un milieu insulaire, on se l'imagine. Dans le
We are less isolated than you would think.
Les îles sont toujours en communication avec la terre d'à côté.
As a fishing community, islanders are always in communication with the mainland.
Ça se voit l'été, c'est quand même un moment où il y a beaucoup de visites.
In the summer, there are lots of visitors, family and tourists.
Étrangers, les touristes, mais l'hiver et l'automne, c'est un peu
In the fall and the winter, we tend to come closer together.
qu'on peut faire ensemble.
The Madeleine, as Hélène sees it, have the opportunity for a return to a more self-sufficient way.
Mon travail consiste à aider les gens à se donner des services collectifs, à améliorer un peu
My
les
work is
conditions
to help people to get services to improve their quality of life.
à reconnaître l'importance de la terre agricole et de l'activité agricole.
This has brought me to appreciate the importance of agriculture in a time when most of our food is imported.
Les produits alimentaires sont importés. Il y a quand même des gens qui font de l'agriculture et
I feel the role of the farmer needs to be supported and
que
upheld.
cette activité-là soit valorisée.
A discovery made while sinking mine shafts was that Les Îles was an oasis of vegetation at the time of the last ice age, some 10,000 years ago. Vulnerable to the effects of the elements, the formation changes daily.
The rocks above the salt itself are what we call in geological terms sandstones. By nature, that's a pretty soft or friable rock, as we call it. Now, the action of the wind and the waves and the elements as in general erodes those rocks, just eats away at them, and then the natural currents in the sea just deposit them as sand dunes between the existing islands or the land masses.
Les efforts qu'on a faits pour protéger le pluvier siffleur nous ont amené aussi à se rendre compte que l'habitat de cet oiseau.
The efforts we made to protect the piping plover made us realize that the habitat of this bird, the dunes, was also challenged.
Un petit sentier pour se rendre à la plage ou une
For instance, a path created to reach the beach or the tracks of a vehicle crossing a dune are like wounds which increase in size through wind erosion.
si on laisse faire la nature. C'est dans ces dossiers-là que le mouvement Attention Fragile le travaille.
The movement Attention Fragile has been working at rehabilitation of the dunes for almost 5 years.
On se rend compte que les gens d'ici.
The results are interesting. People here did not realize the sensitivity of the
Il
dunes.
faut se sensibiliser, connaître un peu mieux.
That is why it is important to understand the flora, fauna, and wildlife to better enjoy an equilibrium in our environment.
Bon équilibre, le milieu.
The interaction of the Madeleine with his or her world takes on all forms. Sand as a medium even finds its way into the cultural expression of the artist's milieu. But the beaches of the archipelago, some of the most expansive on the continent and appealing to most, have historically been friend and foe.
When you're bending your course around these islands without navigational equipment like they have today, just your compass and your log, it's risky business.
Tragedy often accompanies the way of life of the seafarer. The fate of the Miracle in the middle of the last century is a story never forgotten.
When my mother came here in 1906, she knew my great-grandfather well. It was he and his brother that discovered the ship. And he said the morning after a gale, him and his brother William, his brother Bill, he said, went out to a beach to see if anything was coming ashore. He said, we didn't see the ship on our way out because our masts were down. But he said, the first idea that we had that there was any ship, he said, we turned a sand dune. And he said, here was hundreds of people, ragged, wet, cold, sick, huddled together, trying to get warm. But he described them as the most miserable-looking creatures he'd ever saw in his life. He said, some were dead on the beach, others were still landing. And he said, I saw two of the ship's boats leave the ship, manned by women and children. And he said, they smashed together in a heavy groundswell. And he said there were no survivors from either of those boats.
The sea touches every aspect of this archipelago, from its basic rock formation, which appeared when salt water evaporated, to its social and economic development. Owing its existence to the sea, it will be the sea that continues to shape the community's future.
Altogether, 150 people, more or less, will be able to produce 1.5 million tons of ice-controlled salt in an 11-month period. We can extract salt on one level for roughly 5 to 6 years. So in our actual mushroom that we're mining now, we might have about 25, 30 years of production available for us.
Unique in the Canadian mosaic, the Magdalenes, les îles de la Madeleine.
We had the Irish potato famine. We had the French Revolution. We had the expulsion of the Acadians. These first ones were among that lot. And of course, we had the American Revolution and the Second Jacobite Rebellion in Scotland. We got some of them. Now, if you add to that shipwrecked sailors, then you've got the basics for the Madeleine Island population. And that's why I think Madeleine Islanders, the Madeleine is a special breed. I don't mean he's something special to other people, but it took a special person to come here at that time. There was something he couldn't find anywhere else.
I guess it's the warmth of the people. Once you're accepted as part of the community, I mean, people go all out to make you feel at home. Here, you don't really say goodbye. People add after, say, okay, have a nice day or goodbye. They say, if you need anything or if you're in trouble, don't hesitate. Give me a call or come up. I'll help you. That's natural for them.